Dawn crept over the Hurtgen Forest on November 18, 1944, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted German woodland. Private First Class Carlos Ramirez lay completely motionless, his breathing shallow and controlled, rifle barrel peeking through a carefully arranged bundle of pine branches, fallen leaves, and torn burlap. For 36 hours he hadn't moved more than 3 inches in any direction. The cold had seeped into his bones, his fingers numb against the trigger of his Springfield rifle. 20 yards ahead, German officers gathered around a makeshift map table, planning the next counteroffensive that would decimate the advancing American forces. Ramirez's camouflage, improvised from an army blanket, burlap sacks pilfered from a French farm, and local vegetation, rendered him virtually invisible. The German officers spoke freely, unaware of the American sniper who lay in wait, memorizing their plans and positions. When a Waffen-SS officer pointed to a map position and uttered the words that revealed the location of their hidden artillery units, Ramirez had what he needed. Standing orders were clear: remain undetected, gather intelligence, return with the information. But those artillery positions would rain death on American troops within hours if nothing was done. In that moment, Ramirez made a decision that violated every order he'd been given. Drawing on the marksmanship that had once earned him trophies in rural Pennsylvania shooting competitions, he squeezed the trigger. The commanding officer fell instantly. Before the others could react, 3 more precision shots left the remaining officers dead or wounded. The crack of gunfire echoed through the forest, shattering the morning stillness. German soldiers scrambled in panic, firing wildly into the trees, but their bullets passed harmlessly through empty air. By the time they organized a proper search, Ramirez had melted away, crawling backward through the underbrush, his handmade camouflage suit becoming one with the forest floor. No one in the 28th Infantry Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would save hundreds of American lives, or that the improvised camouflage technique he had developed would revolutionize battlefield concealment for the remainder of the war. What Carlos Ramirez did that day, using nothing but scavenged materials and instinct, would eventually become standard military doctrine, taught in sniper schools for generations to come. Carlos Ramirez was born to immigrant parents in the small coal mining town of Hazleton, Pennsylvania, on July 12, 1923. His father, Miguel, had come to America from Spain in 1915, seeking work in the booming mining industry of northeastern Pennsylvania. Miguel found employment with the Lehigh Valley Coal Company, bringing his wife Isabella over from Spain 2 years later. Carlos was their only child, born after several miscarriages had left his mother with little hope of ever having children. Miguel Ramirez was determined that his son would not follow him into the mines. From an early age, he taught Carlos to hunt in the dense woodlands surrounding Hazleton, a skill that put extra food on the table during the Great Depression and instilled in the boy an intimate knowledge of forest environments. By the age of 12, Carlos could track a white-tailed deer through miles of woodland, approach within 20 yards without being detected, and make a clean kill with his father's old Winchester rifle. These hunting trips formed the foundation of what would later become his extraordinary ability to move through hostile territory undetected. My father always said that understanding the forest was more important than understanding the rifle. Ramirez would later write in his memoirs, "Any fool can pull a trigger, but becoming part of the woods, that's what makes a hunter or a soldier." At Hazleton High School, Carlos excelled in both academics and athletics, particularly track and field. His long-distance running abilities caught the attention of several college scouts, but the family had no money for higher education. Instead, Carlos worked alongside his father at the coal company's machine shop, developing mechanical skills that would later serve him well when modifying and maintaining his sniper rifles under battlefield conditions. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Carlos was one of the first in Hazleton to volunteer for military service. He was 18 years old with no way of knowing that his unique combination of hunting skills, mechanical aptitude, and physical endurance would make him invaluable to an army desperate for specialized reconnaissance personnel. Carlos completed basic training at Fort Indiantown Gap in central Pennsylvania, where his marksmanship scores were the highest his drill instructors had ever recorded. One sergeant, a veteran of World War I, took particular interest in the young soldier. Staff Sergeant William Donovan had served as a sniper with the American Expeditionary Forces in France and recognized in Ramirez the rare combination of patience, stealth, and marksmanship that made for an exceptional scout sniper. "Most fellows want to be heroes," Donovan wrote in his recommendation letter for Ramirez's specialized training. "This one's different. He doesn't want glory. He just disappears into the background and gets the job done. I've never seen anyone move through woodland the way he does, like he's part of it." In early 1943, Ramirez was assigned to specialized scout sniper training, a hastily assembled program developed in response to the high casualty rates American forces were experiencing in North Africa and the Pacific. Unlike the British, who had maintained sniper training programs between the world wars, the United States had dismantled such specialized units after 1918. Now, with American troops facing well-trained German and Japanese snipers, the Army was rebuilding its capabilities from scratch. The training was rudimentary by modern standards. Ramirez and other recruits spent weeks learning to estimate distances, adjust for wind conditions, and maintain their weapons under adverse conditions. But the program was notably deficient in camouflage techniques, relying on outdated methods from World War I. Standard issue camouflage consisted of burlap strips attached to helmet nets and sometimes to uniform jackets, wholly inadequate for the close quarters concealment work that effective sniping required. It was here that Ramirez's hunting background gave him a critical advantage. While other trainees struggled with the limited camouflage techniques they were taught, Carlos began experimenting with his own methods, incorporating natural materials gathered from the training grounds. His instructors, initially skeptical, became believers when they repeatedly failed to locate Ramirez during field exercises, even when standing mere feet from his position. By the time he completed training in August 1943, Ramirez had developed a prototype of what would later become known as his ghost suit, a full-body camouflage garment made from burlap, canvas, and natural materials that could be adapted to any environment. He was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division, joining them in England as they prepared for the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The 28th Infantry Division, known as the Keystone Division for its origin in Pennsylvania, had a proud history dating back to the American Civil War. By 1944, it consisted primarily of National Guard units from Pennsylvania, supplemented with draftees and volunteers from across the United States. The division missed the initial D-Day landings but arrived in Normandy in late July 1944, quickly earning a reputation for tenacity in combat. Under the command of Major General Norman Cota, the division participated in the liberation of Paris and then pushed eastward toward Germany. Ramirez's first combat deployment came during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. Assigned to scout ahead of advancing troops, he used his developing camouflage techniques to infiltrate German positions, gathering critical intelligence on troop movements and defensive emplacements. His initial reports were met with skepticism by battalion intelligence officers who couldn't believe that a single scout could penetrate so deeply into enemy territory without detection. "They thought I was making it up," Ramirez recalled years later, "until artillery started landing exactly where I said it would. After that, they paid attention." As summer turned to fall, the 28th Infantry Division pushed into Luxembourg and then toward the German border. The fighting intensified as they approached the Siegfried Line, Germany's heavily fortified western defensive boundary. It was here that Ramirez's skills would be most severely tested, and where his improvised camouflage techniques would evolve from personal survival tool to division-wide tactical asset. The dense forests along the German border provided perfect sniping territory, but also hosted well-concealed German units familiar with the terrain. American casualties mounted as troops entered woodland areas only to be cut down by hidden enemy positions. Conventional reconnaissance methods proved inadequate, with scout patrols frequently ambushed before they could gather useful intelligence. In this increasingly desperate situation, Ramirez's company commander, Captain James Forrester, authorized him to form a small reconnaissance unit that would employ his camouflage and infiltration techniques. Ramirez selected 5 other soldiers with hunting backgrounds, including Private Henry Whitman from rural Maine and Corporal David Martinez from New Mexico. Over the course of 2 weeks in October 1944, Ramirez taught them his methods for creating full-body camouflage from available materials. The standard issue stuff was garbage, Whitman later explained in an interview for the 28th Division's Historical Archive, just some burlap strips on a helmet net. Carlos showed us how to make something that actually worked. We started with our army blankets as a base, cut holes for our arms and head, sewed burlap sacks over that, then attached all kinds of natural material, leaves, grass, small branches, whatever matched our surroundings. When we were done, you could walk within 3 feet of a guy and not see him. What made Ramirez's design revolutionary was its adaptability. Unlike standard issue camouflage, which remained the same regardless of environment, his ghost suits could be quickly modified to match the immediate surroundings. The team carried spare burlap canvas and small bags of twine, allowing them to rebuild their camouflage as they moved between different terrains. Carlos was obsessive about materials, Martinez recalled. He'd spend hours just studying how light hit different kinds of leaves, how shadows formed in the forest. He taught us to think like we were painting a picture, but the canvas was our bodies, and the paint was whatever we could find on the forest floor. The effectiveness of these improvised suits became apparent immediately. In early November 1944, Ramirez's team infiltrated 5 miles behind German lines in the Hurtgen Forest, mapping artillery positions that conventional reconnaissance had failed to locate. They remained in position for 4 days, moving only at night, completely undetected despite German patrols passing within yards of their observation posts. The intelligence they gathered allowed American artillery to neutralize multiple German batteries before the division's main advance, saving countless lives. Word of the team's success spread quickly through the division. Other units began requesting training in what was now being called the Ramirez method. With the authorization of General Cota himself, Ramirez established a makeshift training program, teaching small groups of scouts and snipers how to create and utilize his improvised camouflage suits. The historical context in which Ramirez's innovations took place was one of the most challenging phases of the European theater. By autumn 1944, the initial euphoria following the successful Normandy landings had given way to the harsh reality of fighting a determined enemy on its home territory. The Allied advance had slowed considerably as supply lines stretched thin and German resistance stiffened. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest, which raged from September 1944 to February 1945, exemplified the brutality of this phase of the war. The longest single battle the United States Army ever fought, it took place in a densely wooded area of about 50 square miles near the Belgian-German border. The forest's thick evergreen canopy, steep ravines, and limited road network negated much of the Americans' advantages in air power and mechanized warfare. German forces, under the command of Field Marshal Walter Model, had prepared extensive defensive positions throughout the forest, including concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and vast minefields. They were intimately familiar with the terrain, while American troops struggled with inadequate maps and limited visibility that rarely extended beyond 30 yards in the dense woodland. The 28th Infantry Division entered this nightmarish battlefield in early November 1944, relieving the exhausted 9th Infantry Division. They immediately encountered fierce resistance as they attempted to capture several key villages and crossroads. The division's 109th, 110th, and 112th Infantry regiments suffered catastrophic casualties, losing over 6,000 men in just 2 weeks of fighting. It was in this environment, where visibility was minimal, where a hidden enemy could decimate an entire platoon in seconds, and where conventional reconnaissance methods were failing, that Ramirez's improvised camouflage techniques proved most valuable. His small team of scout snipers provided the only reliable intelligence on German positions, becoming the eyes and ears of a division fighting blind in the forest. The broader strategic context added even greater importance to their work. Unknown to frontline American units at the time, the German High Command was secretly massing forces for what would become the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. The Hurtgen Forest Battle, though appearing as a separate engagement, was actually part of the German strategy to delay American forces while preparations for the larger offensive continued. Intelligence gathered by Ramirez and similar reconnaissance units during this period provided some of the first indications of the coming German offensive, though the significance of their reports wasn't fully appreciated until after the war. Intercepted conversations, observed troop movements, and unusual supply activities all pointed to something larger brewing beyond the immediate battlefield, but higher echelons of command failed to synthesize this information into an accurate prediction of German intentions. Against this backdrop of strategic miscalculation and tactical brutality, Ramirez's small team continued their dangerous work, venturing repeatedly behind enemy lines to gather the intelligence that conventional methods couldn't obtain. Their improvised camouflage suits, constantly refined and adapted, became their most critical survival tool. The military situation in the European theater during the autumn of 1944 was complex and often contradictory. While the overall strategic advantage had clearly shifted to the Allies following the successful Normandy invasion and the liberation of Paris, the tactical reality on the ground was far less favorable. German forces, though stretched thin across multiple fronts, maintained highly effective defensive capabilities and continued to inflict heavy casualties on advancing Allied units. The front lines had stabilized along what military historians would later call the Winter Line, a series of German defensive positions extending from the North Sea to Switzerland. The natural barriers of the Vosges Mountains, the dense Ardennes forest, and the formidable Siegfried Line, or West Wall, provided German defenders with advantageous terrain that negated much of the Allies' superiority in men and material. For the 28th Infantry Division assigned to the V Corps of the First Army, the immediate objective was to penetrate the Siegfried Line and establish bridgeheads across the Roer River. This would require first clearing the Hurtgen Forest, a task that had already defeated 2 previous American divisions. The forest's significance lay not in its intrinsic value, but in its position, protecting the Roer River dams, which the Germans could use to flood the plains beyond, trapping any Allied forces that managed to cross. The division faced the German L-Quatorze Corps, composed primarily of elements of the 275th Infantry Division, a unit that had been rebuilt after suffering heavy losses on the Eastern Front. Though under strength, these were veteran troops familiar with defensive warfare and intimately knowledgeable about the terrain they were defending. They had spent months preparing their positions, laying extensive minefields, establishing pre-registered artillery targets, and creating interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach through the forest. American numerical superiority meant little in this environment. The dense trees prevented tanks and other armored vehicles from maneuvering effectively. Artillery support was hampered by the difficulty of observing falls of shot, while the tree canopy caused many shells to detonate prematurely. Air support was largely ineffective against targets hidden beneath the forest cover. This neutralization of America's conventional advantages forced a return to the most basic forms of infantry combat. Small unit actions where success depended on the skills and initiative of individual soldiers. It was precisely this environment that made Ramirez's reconnaissance work so valuable. In terrain where mechanized forces and conventional tactics faltered, the ability to move undetected through enemy territory and gather accurate intelligence became the division's most precious resource. The camouflage techniques that Ramirez had developed allowed him and his small team to operate in areas where no other American forces could survive. The November 18th mission that began our narrative represented a critical turning point. Intelligence had suggested the presence of a German command post somewhere near the village of Schmidt, but its exact location remained unknown. Division headquarters needed this information to coordinate their next advance, but previous reconnaissance attempts had ended in failure, with scout teams either discovered and killed or forced to retreat before obtaining useful intelligence. Ramirez and his partner for this mission, Private Henry Whitman, volunteered to locate the command post. Using their improvised camouflage suits, recently modified to incorporate the pine needles and brown-gray bark characteristic of the Hurtgen forest in late autumn, they infiltrated German lines during the darkness of early morning on November 17th. Moving with extraordinary patience, sometimes taking an hour to cover 50 yards, they avoided German patrols and minefields, eventually discovering the command post established in a small hunting lodge deep within the forest. For over 24 hours, the two Americans lay in observation positions less than 30 yards from the lodge, documenting German movements and, crucially, overhearing discussions among officers about planned artillery strikes against American positions. They learned that a massive barrage was scheduled for dawn on November 19th, targeting assembly areas where the 28th Division was massing for its next advance. If successful, this barrage would likely inflict thousands of casualties and derail the American offensive for weeks. The standing orders for reconnaissance missions were explicit. Gather intelligence, but avoid engagement with enemy forces at all costs. Ramirez and Whitman were to observe, memorize, and return, nothing more. Direct action was strictly forbidden, as it risked compromising the valuable infiltration routes and techniques that had taken months to develop. But as the morning of November 18th dawned and the German officers gathered outside the lodge to finalize their artillery plans, Ramirez made the fateful decision to intervene directly. The imminent threat to thousands of his fellow soldiers outweighed the standing orders. With extraordinary marksmanship, he eliminated the German command group in a matter of seconds, effectively decapitating the planned artillery strike. The immediate aftermath was chaos among the German forces. Security details searched frantically for the hidden sniper, but Ramirez and Whitman had already begun their careful extraction, moving even more slowly and cautiously than during their infiltration. They reached American lines shortly after midnight on November 19th, bringing with them not only the intelligence they had been sent to gather, but also news of their direct action against the German command group. Their initial reception at division headquarters was mixed. The intelligence they provided was invaluable, allowing for the neutralization of the German artillery positions before they could execute their planned barrage. But Ramirez's decision to engage directly violated standing orders and potentially compromised future reconnaissance operations. A formal reprimand was considered until reports began arriving from other units operating near the German command post. Intercepted radio communications revealed that the elimination of the command group had thrown German artillery coordination into disarray. The planned barrage never materialized, and subsequent German counterattacks were disjointed and ineffective. What might have been a devastating blow to the 28th Division had been averted by Ramirez's unauthorized action. The formal reprimand was quietly forgotten, replaced instead with a field promotion to sergeant and a Bronze Star with Valor device. More significant than the recognition, however, was the increased interest in Ramirez's camouflage techniques. Division headquarters authorized the formation of a dedicated scout sniper section under Ramirez's command, with instructions to train additional personnel in his methods. What had begun as one soldier's improvisation for personal survival was now becoming formalized into division doctrine. As November turned to December, the situation in the Hurtgen Forest grew increasingly desperate for American forces. The 28th Division, having suffered nearly 60% casualties, was relieved by the 8th Infantry Division, but continued to maintain a presence in the sector through specialized units, including Ramirez's scout snipers. The Germans, despite heavy losses of their own, continued to resist fanatically, understanding the strategic importance of delaying the Allied advance. Meanwhile, unknown to the Americans, the massive German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge was being prepared just a short distance away. The intelligence gathered by Ramirez and similar reconnaissance units contained numerous indications of this buildup, but higher headquarters failed to synthesize these reports into an accurate prediction of German intentions. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive erupted with full fury along a 70-mile front in the Ardennes forest, catching American forces by surprise and creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. The 28th Division, still recovering from its mauling in the Hurtgen Forest, lay directly in the path of the main German thrust and suffered additional heavy casualties in the opening days of the battle. Ramirez and his team of scout snipers found themselves operating in increasingly challenging circumstances as German forces surged forward. Their improvised camouflage suits, which had proven so effective in static defensive situations, now needed to be adapted for a fluid battlefield where front lines shifted hourly and enemy forces appeared from unexpected directions. The rising action intensified as winter descended upon the Ardennes forest in December 1944. The German offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge caught American forces by surprise, sending them reeling backward and creating a massive salient in the Allied lines. The 28th Division, already depleted from the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, found itself directly in the path of the main German thrust. As chaos engulfed the front lines, with American units being overrun or cut off, the value of accurate intelligence increased exponentially. Conventional reconnaissance methods collapsed entirely in the face of rapidly advancing German armored columns. Radio communications broke down as units lost contact with their headquarters. In this environment of confusion and fear, Ramirez's small team of scout snipers became one of the division's most reliable sources of battlefield information. On December 18th, 2 days into the German offensive, Ramirez received urgent orders to locate the headquarters of the 2nd Panzer Division, which intelligence suggested was spearheading the German advance toward the critical road junction at Bastogne. With communication lines severed and the front lines dissolving, there was no way to know exactly where German forces were concentrated or which routes remained open to American units attempting to establish defensive positions. Ramirez selected 3 members of his team for this critical mission: Privates Henry Whitman and David Martinez, both veterans of previous reconnaissance operations, and Private First Class Michael Thornton, a recent addition to the team who had shown exceptional promise during training. They prepared their camouflage suits for winter conditions, incorporating white parachute cloth salvaged from supply drops and pale birch bark to match the snow-covered landscape. The winter suits were the hardest to get right, Thornton later recalled. In summer, you've got all kinds of vegetation to work with. In winter, everything's white and brown, with very little texture. We had to become shadows in the snow. The team departed American lines before dawn on December 19th, moving northeast through terrain now firmly under German control. The winter forest presented new challenges for concealment. The leafless trees offered less overhead cover, while footprints in the snow could betray their position to enemy observers. They developed a technique of moving only during light snowfall, when fresh powder would quickly cover their tracks, and carefully sweeping pine boughs behind them when crossing exposed areas. By midday, they had penetrated nearly 8 miles behind German lines, witnessing firsthand the scale of the offensive. Endless columns of German armor and infantry moved westward along the roads, while supply trucks and horse-drawn artillery headed in the opposite direction. The Americans maintained detailed counts of German equipment and troop strengths, information that would prove invaluable for planning the eventual Allied counterattack. Late that afternoon, they located what appeared to be the 2nd Panzer Division's forward headquarters in an abandoned Belgian farmhouse near the village of Houffalize. German staff cars and radio vehicles surrounded the building, with senior officers coming and going continuously. For the next 36 hours, the 4 Americans maintained constant observation, rotating watch duties while concealed in a nearby woodlot. The intelligence they gathered was alarming. The German advance was proceeding more rapidly than American commanders realized, with forward elements already approaching the Meuse River. Fuel shortages, which Allied intelligence had believed would quickly halt the German offensive, appeared to be less severe than anticipated. Most critically, they overheard discussions of a planned encirclement of Bastogne, where elements of the 101st Airborne Division were attempting to organize a defensive perimeter. With this vital information in hand, Ramirez made the difficult decision to split his team. Martinez and Thornton would attempt to reach American lines with the intelligence, while Ramirez and Whitman would remain in position to continue gathering information on German movements. The risk was substantial. No one knew exactly where American lines now stood, and the 2 messengers would have to traverse territory swarming with German forces. Martinez and Thornton departed shortly after midnight on December 21st, carrying hand-drawn maps showing German dispositions and written notes detailing troop strengths and apparent objectives. Their journey quickly turned nightmarish as they encountered German patrols, vehicle columns, and makeshift checkpoints. Several times they were forced to lie motionless in the snow for hours, their white camouflaged bodies mere feet from German soldiers. At one particularly harrowing moment, a German patrol stopped directly beside Thornton's position to light cigarettes. One soldier actually sat down on what he thought was a snow-covered log. In reality, Thornton's camouflaged legs. Only the effectiveness of their improvised winter camouflage prevented discovery and certain death. After 38 hours of continuous movement, Martinez and Thornton finally reached an American outpost near Bastogne, manned by elements of the 101st Airborne Division. Their intelligence was immediately relayed to division headquarters and then to higher commands, providing some of the first accurate information on German dispositions since the offensive began. Meanwhile, Ramirez and Whitman maintained their observation post near the German headquarters, continuing to gather intelligence on enemy movements. For 4 more days they remained in position, surviving on K-rations and melted snow, their bodies numbed by the constant cold, but their observation never faltering. The effectiveness of their winter camouflage suits was demonstrated repeatedly as German patrols passed within yards of their position without detecting their presence. On the morning of December 24th, they observed a significant change in German activities. Staff officers were burning documents outside the farmhouse headquarters, while vehicle columns that had been moving westward were now being redirected to the north and south. It appeared that the German advance had stalled, and a redeployment was underway. This information needed to reach American commanders immediately. Ramirez and Whitman abandoned their observation post and began moving west, hoping to reach American lines before the tactical situation changed again. Their journey proved even more difficult than that of their teammates. Twice they narrowly avoided German patrols, and once they were forced to remain completely immobile for over 6 hours, as a German infantry company established a temporary bivouac around their position. On Christmas Day, 1944, they encountered a 3-man German reconnaissance team in a small clearing. There was no way to avoid contact. Using their camouflaged positions to full advantage, Ramirez and Whitman eliminated the German soldiers with their knives, then quickly continued westward, knowing that the missing patrol would soon trigger a wider search. By December 26th, they had reached the outskirts of Bastogne, where American forces had been surrounded, but were holding their defensive perimeter. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its climax, with German forces unable to capture the vital road junction despite repeated attacks. The intelligence that Martinez and Thornton had delivered days earlier had helped American commanders anticipate German movements and allocate their limited resources effectively. When Ramirez and Whitman finally entered American lines, they brought updated information on German redeployments that suggested the offensive had culminated and was beginning to lose momentum. This assessment proved accurate. The German advance had indeed reached its high-water mark, and Allied counterattacks would soon begin pushing the enemy back toward the German border. The 4 scout snipers were reunited at division headquarters on December 27th. Their mission, conducted under the most extreme conditions imaginable, had provided intelligence that General Patton later described as worth a division of tanks. All 4 were awarded Silver Stars for their actions, and their report was disseminated throughout the First Army as an example of exceptional reconnaissance work. More significant than the medals, however, was the increased attention now paid to Ramirez's improvised camouflage techniques. The winter suits that had allowed his team to operate undetected behind German lines for over a week had demonstrated the critical importance of adaptive, environment-specific camouflage. Division headquarters authorized Ramirez to establish a formal training program, teaching his methods to scout and reconnaissance personnel from across the First Army. "We never set out to change Army doctrine," Ramirez later wrote. "We were just trying to stay alive in impossible situations. But sometimes the best innovations come from necessity rather than planning." As January 1945 began, the German offensive had been contained, and Allied forces were pushing the enemy back toward the original front lines. The 28th Division, having suffered enormous casualties in both the Hurtgen Forest and the Bulge, was withdrawn to Luxembourg for rest and rebuilding. Ramirez's Scout Sniper Section, however, remained active, now operating as a direct asset of V Corps headquarters. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest on record in Western Europe, presenting new challenges for camouflage and battlefield mobility. Ramirez continued to refine his techniques, developing what he called the snowfield suit, a full-body white camouflage garment that incorporated materials salvaged from parachutes, tent canvas, and medical gauze. These suits proved remarkably effective in the snow-covered Ardennes, allowing scout snipers to operate in open terrain that would normally provide no concealment. By February 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final push into Germany, Ramirez's techniques had spread far beyond his original team. Infantry divisions across the European theater were establishing their own scout sniper sections, using the Ramirez method of improvised environment-specific camouflage. What had begun as one soldier's desperate improvisation was now becoming standardized doctrine taught to hundreds of reconnaissance specialists. The climax of this remarkable story came in March 1945, as American forces prepared to cross the Rhine River, the last major geographical barrier before the German heartland. The Rhine crossings would be among the most challenging operations of the war, with American troops forced to navigate a broad, swift-flowing river in the face of determined German resistance. On March 7, 1945, elements of the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, establishing the first Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. German forces immediately began massing for counterattacks to eliminate this dangerous penetration. Allied commanders needed accurate intelligence on these German concentrations to protect the vulnerable bridgehead. Ramirez, now a technical sergeant leading an expanded 12-man scout sniper section, received orders to cross the Rhine and gather intelligence on German artillery positions targeting the bridge. This would be their most dangerous mission yet, infiltrating territory where German forces were densely concentrated and on high alert. For this operation, Ramirez developed a new variant of his camouflage suit specifically designed for the mixed urban-rural environment east of the Rhine. These rubble suits incorporated materials that matched the gray-brown tones of bombed-out German villages and factories, allowing the scout snipers to move through destroyed urban areas without detection. On the night of March 9th, Ramirez led 8 of his men across the Rhine in small rubber boats, landing several miles downstream from the Remagen Bridge to avoid German observation posts. For the next 5 days, they operated in small two-man teams, mapping German artillery positions, command posts, and assembly areas for counterattacks. Their improvised camouflage proved as effective in this new environment as it had in the forests and snow-covered fields, allowing them to move undetected through areas teeming with German troops. The intelligence they gathered proved decisive. German forces were indeed massing for a major counterattack against the bridgehead, scheduled for March 15th. Artillery positions on the surrounding heights had been reinforced with heavy guns capable of destroying the already damaged bridge. German infantry units were assembling in villages and woodlots east of Remagen, preparing to assault the American positions along the river. With this information in hand, American commanders took immediate action. Artillery strikes targeted the German gun positions, while air attacks disrupted their assembly areas. When the German counterattack finally came, it was disjointed and ineffective, easily repulsed by the reinforced American units defending the bridgehead. The Rhine crossing, perhaps the most critical single operation in the final phase of the European War, had been secured. All 8 members of Ramirez's team returned safely from this mission, bringing with them detailed maps and information that General Omar Bradley later described as the most valuable intelligence product of the Rhine campaign. Ramirez was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor, while the other team members received Silver Stars. But the greatest recognition of Ramirez's contribution came in a less formal manner. In April 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Army's European Theater of Operations published Technical Memorandum number 2845, Improvised Camouflage Techniques for Scout Sniper Operations. This document, distributed to all infantry divisions, codified the methods that Ramirez had developed through trial and error over the previous 18 months. Though it did not mention him by name, a security precaution to protect him in case of capture, everyone in the reconnaissance community knew these as the Ramirez techniques. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Ramirez's methods had become standard doctrine for scout sniper operations throughout the European theater. What had begun as one soldier's desperate improvisation had evolved into established military practice, saving countless American lives and contributing significantly to the Allied victory. The Allied victory in Europe brought an end to combat operations, but Ramirez's work continued. In June 1945, he was transferred to the Pacific Theater, where American forces were preparing for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. His mission was to train scout sniper units in the improvised camouflage techniques that had proven so effective in Europe, adapting them for the jungle and beach environments they would encounter in Japan. Based at a training facility on Okinawa, Ramirez worked with reconnaissance units from the 6th and 8th Armies, developing new variants of his camouflage suits specifically designed for Pacific conditions. The jungle suit incorporated local vegetation and manufactured materials dyed in mottled green patterns, while the beach suit used sand-colored burlap and crushed seashells to match the coastal landing zones. Though the anticipated invasion never occurred due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings, the techniques Ramirez developed would influence military camouflage doctrine for decades to come. When the war ended in August 1945, Technical Sergeant Carlos Ramirez had accumulated an extraordinary record: 28 reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, 14 confirmed enemy kills as a sniper, 3 Purple Hearts for wounds received in action, and decorations including the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, and Bronze Star with Valor Device. More significant than these personal achievements, however, was his lasting impact on military doctrine. Ramirez returned to the United States in November 1945 and was honorably discharged from the Army the following month. Like many combat veterans, he initially struggled to readjust to civilian life. The intense focus and constant vigilance that had kept him alive in enemy territory were difficult to set aside in peaceful surroundings. He returned to Hazleton, Pennsylvania, but found the coal mining town too confining after his wartime experiences. In 1947, he used his GI Bill benefits to enroll at Pennsylvania State University, studying forestry and wildlife management. These fields allowed him to apply the woodcraft skills that had served him so well during the war to peaceful purposes. He graduated in 1951 and accepted a position with the U.S. Forest Service, working initially in the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. Ramirez's military experience was not forgotten, however. In 1953, as the Korean War continued, he was contacted by the Army's Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia. The techniques he had developed during World War II were being incorporated into the formal curriculum for scout sniper training, and the instructors wanted his input on the program. Though he declined to return to active military service, Ramirez agreed to serve as a civilian consultant, making regular visits to Fort Benning to advise on camouflage and reconnaissance techniques. It was strange to see something I had created out of desperation becoming formalized doctrine, he later wrote. What we did in the Hurtgen Forest and the Ardennes was just trying to stay alive and complete our missions. Now they were teaching it as if there had been some grand plan behind it all. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Ramirez continued his career with the Forest Service, eventually rising to the position of Regional Wildlife Manager for the Eastern Region. He married Eleanor Martinez, no relation to his wartime comrade, in 1954, and they raised 3 children in a small home near the Allegheny National Forest. Though he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences to his family, he maintained contact with the surviving members of his scout sniper team, holding regular reunions until his death. The impact of Ramirez's innovations extended far beyond his personal story. The improvised camouflage techniques he developed evolved into the modern ghillie suit, now standard equipment for military snipers worldwide. The principles he established, using local materials to create environment-specific camouflage, adapting constantly to changing conditions, and emphasizing full-body concealment rather than just head and shoulders, remain fundamental to military camouflage doctrine today. In the Korean War, American sniper teams employed refined versions of Ramirez's suits, allowing them to operate effectively in the challenging mountain terrain of the Korean Peninsula. During the Vietnam War, the technique evolved further with specialized suits developed for jungle, rice paddy, and highland environments. Modern military snipers in Afghanistan and Iraq continue to use principles first established by Ramirez's improvised techniques, though with the benefit of advanced synthetic materials unknown in the 1940s. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Carlos Ramirez's work is found not in the physical camouflage techniques themselves, but in the philosophy behind them. His fundamental insight that effective concealment requires adaptation to specific environments rather than standardized solutions revolutionized military thinking about camouflage. Before Ramirez, Army camouflage consisted primarily of standardized patterns and materials issued to all troops, regardless of their operating environment. After his innovations demonstrated the effectiveness of adaptive, environment-specific concealment, military doctrine shifted toward the specialized approach that continues today. Carlos Ramirez remained with the Forest Service until his retirement in 1983, after which he and Eleanor moved to a small cabin he built himself near the Delaware Water Gap in eastern Pennsylvania. He continued to serve as an occasional consultant for military and wildlife management programs, sharing his expertise in concealment and observation techniques. Though he received numerous invitations to write his memoirs or participate in historical documentaries about World War II snipers, he declined most of these opportunities, preferring to maintain the privacy that had become his natural state after years of reconnaissance work. When he died peacefully in his sleep on October 3, 2001, at the age of 78, his obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Forest Service career and his family, but made only passing reference to his military service. The full extent of his wartime innovations and their lasting impact on military doctrine remained largely unknown to his neighbors and community. It was as if, even in death, he maintained the concealment that had defined his most significant contribution to history. The true measure of Carlos Ramirez's legacy lies not in public recognition, but in the lives saved by his innovations. In every conflict since World War II, American reconnaissance personnel and snipers have employed variations of his techniques, allowing them to gather critical intelligence while remaining undetected in hostile territory. Though the materials and methods have evolved with technology, the fundamental principles he established through desperate improvisation in the forests of Europe continue to protect American soldiers in combat zones worldwide. In modern military training, the ghillie suit is now a standard element of sniper school curriculum. At Fort Benning's, U.S. Army Sniper School, students still construct their own suits by hand, adapting them to specific training environments, a direct continuation of the methods Ramirez pioneered. Though few of these young snipers know the name of the man who first developed these techniques, they are the living embodiment of his legacy. The story of Carlos Ramirez and his improvised camouflage suits offers a powerful lesson in military innovation. The most effective advances often come not from research laboratories or formal development programs, but from the desperate creativity of soldiers solving immediate problems in combat. Ramirez had no specialized training in camouflage techniques, no access to advanced materials or scientific testing. He had only his hunting background, mechanical aptitude, and the urgent need to remain undetected in enemy territory. From these limited resources, he created a system that would transform military doctrine and save countless lives. In today's highly technological military environment, with computer-designed camouflage patterns and advanced synthetic materials, it is easy to overlook the importance of such battlefield improvisation. Yet the principles Ramirez established, adapting to specific environments, using available materials creatively, and constantly refining techniques based on practical experience, remain as valid now as they were in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes in 1944. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is that it nearly went untold. Had it not been for the efforts of military historians in the 1990s, who tracked down surviving members of Ramirez's team and pieced together their accounts from unit records and after-action reports, this critical innovation might have been lost to history, remembered only as an anonymous technique rather than the achievement of specific individuals responding to the challenges of combat. The evolution of military camouflage since Ramirez's innovations has been one of refinement rather than revolution. Modern ghillie suits use synthetic materials that offer advantages in weight and durability compared to the burlap and canvas of World War II improvisations, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Military snipers still adapt their camouflage to specific environments, still integrate local vegetation into their suits, and still focus on breaking up the human silhouette rather than merely matching background colors. What would Carlos Ramirez think of these modern developments? Those who knew him in his later years suggest he would be quietly satisfied but not surprised. He always maintained that his techniques were simply the application of common sense to the problem of battlefield concealment. The fact that these methods have endured for over 7 decades would seem to him only natural, evidence that he had identified fundamental principles rather than temporary solutions. In a world where military technology advances at a dizzying pace with new weapon systems, communications networks, and battlefield sensors emerging continually, the endurance of Ramirez's simple improvised camouflage techniques stands as a powerful reminder of an essential truth. In the chaos and desperation of combat, the creativity and adaptability of individual soldiers often matter more than the most sophisticated technology. As we consider the legacy of Carlos Ramirez and his improvised ghillie suits, we might ask ourselves a profound question about courage and innovation in warfare. Would you have broken the rules as he did that morning in the Hurtgen forest? Would you have risked a court-martial by engaging enemy forces during what was supposed to be a reconnaissance-only mission? Or would you have followed orders and withdrawn with your intelligence, allowing the planned artillery barrage to proceed against your fellow soldiers? These are not easy questions, for they pit military discipline against individual moral judgment, formal doctrine against battlefield reality. Ramirez chose to act according to his conscience rather than his orders, a decision that saved hundreds of American lives, but might, under different circumstances, have compromised broader strategic objectives. His choice reminds us that warfare is ultimately a human endeavor, where individual decisions in desperate moments can change the course of battles and even campaigns. The story of how Army snipers made improvised ghillie suits to survive the battlefields of World War II is more than a tale of military innovation. It is a testament to the resilience and creativity of soldiers adapting to the most challenging environments imaginable. From the dense forests of the Hurtgen to the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, from the rubble of bombed-out German towns to the anticipated jungle battlefields of the Pacific, these improvised camouflage techniques allowed American scout snipers to gather the intelligence that shaped battles and saved lives. Carlos Ramirez never sought recognition for his innovations. Like many of the greatest heroes of World War II, he did what was necessary in the moment, then returned to a quiet civilian life when the conflict ended. His legacy lives on, not in medals or monuments, but in the techniques that continue to protect American reconnaissance personnel and snipers in combat zones around the world. It lives in the fundamental shift in military thinking about camouflage, from standardized solutions to adaptive, environment-specific concealment. In an age of precision-guided munitions, satellite reconnaissance, and thermal imaging, it might seem that the simple camouflage techniques pioneered by Ramirez would have lost their relevance. Yet the opposite has proven true. As detection technology advances, the need for effective concealment becomes even more critical. Modern snipers and reconnaissance specialists still rely on variations of Ramirez's techniques, adapted for contemporary battlefields but fundamentally unchanged in their basic principles. Perhaps this is the most fitting tribute to Carlos Ramirez and the improvised ghillie suits he created in the desperate days of World War II. Not that his specific techniques have survived unchanged, but that the philosophy of adaptive, environment-specific camouflage he pioneered has become a permanent part of military doctrine. What began as one soldier's desperate improvisation has evolved into a fundamental approach to battlefield concealment that continues to save lives more than 7 decades later. Share this story so others will remember what one man's ingenuity and courage can achieve even in the darkest moments of history's most devastating conflict.